And those 6 points are, as a standard of care, a water management program should have a very robust water management team, leaders that are well trained and clearly understand what their roles and responsibilities are and are kept accountable. That water management team, as well as any staff that are involved in executing the program, are regularly and well trained. Number three, your control measures, the things that you're actually doing on site or monitoring, are reasonable. They have limits that you keep track of, and you justify why you have the control measures that you have. At minimum, a water management team should meet quarterly. And when they have that meeting, they should review the records and verify them. You cannot have a standard of care for water management program. You cannot have an active program without testing for Legionella. And finally, once a year, your water system should be resurveyed. A proactive risk assessment should be provided, and you should be updating your program regularly. So I want to get a little bit into the details of each of these points, starting with the water management team. And if you read ASHRAE 188, which I have, and I attend the 188 committee meetings, the minimum required, what ASHRAE 188 says you need to have, is someone from senior leadership that has authority to make decisions, someone from facilities management staff, and then someone from infection prevention if you're healthcare. Now that's it. That's all ASHRAE 188 says. And if you have these three people on your team, if you're healthcare, you're off to a good start. You're doing what's minimally required. What I recommend and what I've seen out in the field as useful is someone from housekeeping or whomever, janitorial service, whatever you call them, environmental services, housekeeping, environmental services. They're often your first line of defense. They're often exposed to the water systems more than anyone else in your facility. So they can help you with things like flushing. They can help you identify problems early because they're out on the floor seeing these things every day. Another recommended member is any of your trusted vendors or your water management consultant. They can be your resource for questions. They can also be there in a pinch and execute anything that you may need that's above and beyond the skill level or the qualifications of your internal team. The last thing that I would say at this point is more than recommended, I would say it should be required, is that at least one member of your team, it could be your consultant, but it could be someone internal, should be an ASSE certified Legionella safety and water management personnel. Now, what the heck is that? Many of you may not have heard of this certification. It's relatively new, so I'll get into it a little bit. ASSE, the American Society of Sanitation Engineers, and IAPMO published a qualification standard this year for folks who sit on a water management team. It is considered the minimum qualifications that should be expected for someone who sits on a water management team and provides advice. And this thing is great because before this certification, you as a consumer had no way to know whether or not your Legionella consultant is qualified. You had no way to know if you had defensible advice. So this certification, it's a training program and a test with a certification number, helps you feel comfortable knowing that the folks you have on your team are qualified, are certified, and are going to provide you industry standard advice. Is a little bit on clearly defined roles and responsibilities. This is just an example, but I want to see in a program document that everybody on that team, and this is just an example, has clearly defined roles. I have their contact information. I know what they're doing. So training, I know we get a lot of training in our business life, but the fact of the matter is if your staff do not understand why they're doing what they're doing, they may not execute it properly, or they may not really appreciate the importance of what they're doing. So I recommend once a year for relevant staff, you have some type of water safety training. This can be conducted by ASSE certified personnel or just anyone who's qualified, but I think that ASSE certification is really going to help you there. As far as what should be included, Basic Legionella biology is always great. You should be reviewing the water systems with your staff so they understand what's actually in your building. You should walk through your actual program document and help your staff know what's in there. And then, explain to each team within your facility what their specific roles and responsibilities are and how you're going to keep them accountable. That keeps things active. As far as reasonable control measures and how you monitor things in your building go, you need to make sure that they're reasonable. And I want to press on this word reasonable here because I'm both using the legal term and kind of using the colloquial term as well. The legal term, for anyone who's unfamiliar, is this idea that what would a reasonable, prudent person do under the given circumstances that you are sitting on in your specific facility. So, someone who is making a decision in a lawsuit would say, okay, I'm going to sit myself in their facility. If I'm trying to be reasonable, what would I do given my knowledge and my constraints? Well, no reasonable person would ignore industry standards and guidelines. You can never go wrong using industry standards and guidelines to develop your control measures. So this is a good way to evaluate and hold your control measures up to a standard of care by saying, is what we're doing aligning with what the industry is stating? And given the constraints of our staff, of our finances, all of those things are fine, but you want to make sure you're at least considering these things. And also, they are not occurring if they are not being recorded. If it isn't documented, it didn't happen. And when you are being scrutinized in a lawsuit or in an investigation from a health department, it is a huge sigh of relief when you can grab your logs of everything you've done to protect your water systems and slap them on the desk. It'll raise eyebrows. In those logs, you want to be as specific as you can get away with. You want to include the dates, the times, where you did something, who did it, what monitoring or action was done, and any observations. This should be very robust. It should be complicated. It should take a long time to dig through because you have a complex water system. If you get ahead of things and you do it now, in years from now, you're going to be very grateful you have them. And frankly, outside of once a quarter reading them, you shouldn't really need to do much more with them. So they don't need to be a lot of extra work. Thanks to time here, I'm going to skip over these a little bit. I'm not going to get into too much detail. I just wanted to give you a few examples of some logs. I'm not saying these are perfect logs. And in fact, we can look at ways that we could improve these. But anything that keeps a record, whether you do it by hand or an example here, whether you do it in your building automation, your building management system, just start baking in ways that you're monitoring what you're actually doing. Okay. So question for all of you, another flag in the presentation here. Answer me this: the control measures that you have at your facility, do you believe they are reasonable and they are achievable? Are you shooting for the moon and not able to achieve them? Are they maybe a little less than ideal, a little too easy, or are they just center of the bullseye?
We'll give it about 10 more seconds for everyone to answer.
All right. Oh, looks like I can't share the poll. I think hopefully you guys can see this. It looks like the spread I would expect. None of you think that you are just not doing what you're supposed to, and that's great. It's exactly what I expected. This middle of the road idea that some of your control measures are probably reasonable and being executed, and some aren't. And now you, upon reflection, may have an area where you can leave this presentation and target. And I'll tell you this: where you should be reflecting on this more so than ever is during your water management team meetings. As you remember, this is another point on the standard of care. Your water management team meetings should be held regularly and they should be useful to you. I recommend quarterly. It's not minimally required to do quarterly. However, you can imagine a lot of logs, a lot of questions, a lot of activity builds up over time. And if you're holding your team meetings only maybe once a year, you have a lot to review on that annual review, right? I mean, I do annual reviews for some of my customers and they take hours. If you split it up and do things once a quarter, you have a lot less work to do each quarter. Your meetings can only last 45 minutes. They can be a lot more swallowable. Also, you're much more resilient because you're touching base with things much more frequently and can respond to things. So issues aren't pending for a whole year before they see resolution. Remember, your water management team should be a team of people who can execute action, who can make decisions, and then those decisions are done. Okay. So as a result of that, attendance should be considered mandatory for anyone you specify on your water management team. They need to be there because they are people that have actionable power in your facility. Mainly what you're doing at these meetings is you're looking over those control measure logs, you're making sure things are being done, and you're recommending any changes. The last thing I'll say about your water management team meetings, just like the control measure logs, if you don't keep a record of those meetings, of who was there, when it happened, what you talked about, that meeting didn't exist. You need to have those records and you need to be able to pull them up. You're going to be grateful for that because you're going to be able to refer back to them and you're going to be much more efficient with your time. And you're also going to be able to hold people accountable. You're just going to have a much more effective, active program. Legionella testing, as I mentioned earlier, cannot be avoided if you want an active, defensible water management program. And as such, it should be considered standard and part of a standard of care. Validation is required by ASHRAE 188. Validation means that you are assessing the efficacy of your program. Is it actually doing what you're trying to set out to do? And if you aren't testing for Legionella, the only other metric you have to determine the efficacy of your program is waiting for someone to get sick. And there are obvious problems with waiting for someone to get sick. One, once they've become sick, now you're open to liability. But two, we don't want anyone to get sick, right? We want to cut this off before it ever becomes a problem. So we want to know the Legionella status of our building. The major resistance I get to Legionella testing, and I want to address it here, is it does not expose you to liability. Okay, it does not necessarily expose you to liability. I hear so often, if we test for it, we're going to find it. And if we find it, now we have a problem we didn't have before. The fact of the matter is you always had that problem. And you were just sticking your fingers in your ears. It was just waiting to rear its ugly head. By discovering it, now you can make reasonable, much cheaper, may I add, corrective measures, keep a record of those corrective measures, retest, maybe we get better results, maybe they're even negative. Now we have this really powerful record that, hey, we did our due diligence. We looked for it, we resolved it, we're pretty clear here. Last thing I'll say about validation is that make sure that that testing is done by a third party and that the lab is CDC Elite certified. I'm happy to talk to you more about that after the presentation. But the idea of third party is just, you don't want a wolf guarding your hen house. You don't want any invitation of bias. You want to make sure that the results that you're getting are reliable. Finally, the last point of our standard of care is that you're annually surveying your water systems, even if nothing's changed, just to identify any potential changes or prove the negative, prove that nothing has changed. So this allows you to keep your program up to date. It allows you as a leader to refamiliarize yourself with the water system. And then it allows you to do a proactive risk assessment, which is related, but a little different. A proactive risk assessment isn't just taking inventory in your building, it's looking for risks. It should be conducted by someone outside your organization that is qualified so that, again, they're unbiased. And it should all culminate in a report that looks at the risk, identifies them, lists them out by priority, and then finally contains recommendations. What do we do about these risks? An important point finally